Hello, welcome to the first in this series of videos where we're going to be taking a look at the frankly immense Surge, which is a free synth. It was originally a commercial product, but due to the generosity of the immensely talented Claes Johansson, it has become an open source project and has carried on its development. This is version 1.9, which introduces some new features, but if you're not aware of Surge, certainly, I think it's worth taking a look. The first part of this video is going to be a quick tour of the synth itself, and then I'll look at some of the presets, and then we're going to dive in and look at in this video, the oscillators. In future video, we'll be looking at the filters and modulation, etc. But there's so much to pack in here. This could be a 2-hour-long video without getting everything in place. It's definitely a quick overview, but as I say, there's so many features. It's quick in terms of looking at each feature, but it's not going to be a short video, as you'll see. So strap in and let's take a look at Surge. So here we have Surge on screen, and I'm just going to take you through a few of its general features before we head off into the presets. First thing first, it is resizable. So we can resize it just by dragging the window, and I can make it tiny if I want. We go to certain limits, but it certainly can go pretty small, or it can go massively big. So if you've got a 4K screen and you're using it 100%, you can make this big enough to fit on there. It does have some presets already set in here, so some zoom presets, and something you may need to do is to set the current level as default. So if you want to keep that, I'll just resize this so the menu appears on screen. If you want to keep that, you'd need to pick set current zoom level as default, and then it would always open up by that as default. So that's a small tip about that, but I'll put it back to 125%. There are some skins available, so you can change the appearance, but generally I don't mess around with these kind of things because I'm fairly boring. So I'll just stick with the default skin, but you can make it look different, but have all the same controls. And we're just going to take a look at a few of the features around here. So firstly, we've got two different scenes. So in the default single mode, you are on scene A typically, but if you go to scene B, you can make changes. So I'm going to change the pitch here, put it up to 7 and play a note. So I'm playing a C here. If I play the same note on scene A, we can see we are back on the C. So changing between them. And you've got these different modes here where you can have it so it splits on a given key. So here it's on C4, which should mean... So there I'm playing a B on my keyboard, which is a concert pitch, as it were. When I move to the C, it then moves to scene B, and then we're up in pitch. You'll have to take my word for that. Channel split would be where it would split on different channels. I don't have the easy ability to demonstrate that, but in dual mode, you can play both at the same time. So we're going to have the 5th harmony with the 7 semitones. So you can play both of those at the same time and disappear to the gambling planet in the original series of Battlestar Galactica if you want to show your age. But that can be quite useful, something you may or may not want to play around with. We've got the patch browser here, which we will look at in a minute, status, and then FX bypass character. So you can turn the effects section off. So here on the right, we've got this effects routing section and the effect itself. That will be covered in another video. There's quite a lot you can do in here. It's quite nice to have these effects in there. Now, moving down here, we have the oscillators. So that's going to be the main focus of this video once we've been through the presets. General controls, bend depth and play mode, etc. So you can control those interesting things. You've got oscillator drift and noise color, which is useful for making the sound much more subtractive hardware analog synth. The FM routing of the oscillators, filter configuration, which again we will come to in a later video, and then the scene output. So for instance, volume and pan, so I can quickly play with that. So you can hear that in action, pretty straightforward. The width and also send effect level. So when you're using these send effects here, you've got those controls here. We've got a mixer here, which allows us to mix the 3 oscillators. We've got a ring modulator where you've got a 1x2 or 2x3, and also a noise oscillator. So if I unmute that, You can hear that noise oscillator in there, an overall gain. And then we've got filter controls. So various different filter types. Again, these will be covered in a later video because there is so much to cover in this. Again, we've got 2 filter types, the ability to route them flexibly, etc., balance between the 2. Next, we've got the routing section, which I think of really as a modulation matrix, but it's about the routing of different things in terms of modulation control, which allows you to do this. Very briefly, you can pick most of these. Any of these with an arrow are then editable in this lower section here. So, for instance, if we want to look at LFO1, we just click that arrow. Now we're looking at LFO1, but you can also change the type of that. Again, we'll look at this in the video. And then this section here, which is the pretty flexible modulation signal generators, which are hugely useful for this kind of thing. So there's really so much to cover here that it definitely wouldn't get any kind of reasonable coverage in just a half-hour long video or so. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to cover. A couple of things about using these controls. If you want to reset them to their default, so let's say you wanted shape to go back to its default. If you double click it, it will go back to that, which generally will be 0. If you want to set a specific value in there, if you right click or 2-finger tap, you can pick edit value and then pick, let's say 6 for that. If you find it tricky to get that to exactly 6, as is often the case with this, if you hold down the shift key with most VST instruments, you'll find that if you hold down the shift key, you get much finer resolution. So you can control that. So there I can get that precisely to 6 without having to resort to editing like that. And with that brief overview of Surge's controls, we're going to head off into looking at some presets now. And there is a huge amount to audition. So here we go. Here's some of the presets that I like. Now, the first thing is that there are an immense amount of presets available. So this is just the default. So we've got all these factory patches, but also these third-party patches. And you can see that each one of these will tend to have subcategories. There are hundreds to go through. So as is often the case, you'll need to spend some time with this to get the best out of it and find some sounds that you like. You might like every sound. You might hate all of them but 6, but it's definitely worth taking a look through and having a listen. But here's some of the sounds that I've been listening to and found pretty useful while I've been playing around with this. So that's a very quick run through of just a few of the patches which come with Surge. There's actually more available because Surge has been used quite a few times for plugin preset competitions. So there are packs by some of the people who are listed here and also available on sites such as KVR. So there's plenty more if this doesn't satisfy your appetite for sounds. One nice thing is that it's possible to browse using the arrows and go through categories and then individual patches, which makes it much easier if you're trying to pick, let's say, a bass. You can just go into the bass folder and then cycle through the patches. Again, it's only a small thing, but it's often the small things in user interfaces which make it nice to use the synth. So even if you were just going to load this up and use it for presets, you'd probably get a lot of mileage out of this. There's just so much depth to it and so many different sounds that you can get out of it. So just by loading up presets, let alone by programming it. But that's where we're going to head in next. So next we're going to take a look, starting off with the oscillators. So I'm going to load up the initial sine patch, which is under templates and then initial sine, because this is, as you can hear, a nice simple sine patch. And so we can see this and Surge at a reasonable size at the same time. I'm going to take always on top off on Surge and put it on supervision and then just resize it slightly. So we're not going to worry too much about the effects section and master volume until much later on. So this will hopefully allow you to see as much as is possible on the screen. So this area we're dealing with at the moment is this oscillator here. Now, it's easy to think, well, it's just an oscillator, but one of the real powers of Surge is it has multiple different oscillator types you can put in, and they are selected with this control here. So if we click here, we can see we've got quite a few different options. The first of which is classic. So picking classic, we can pick either sawtooth or square, and these are actually really presets. So the classic is what we will pick. I'm going to pick sawtooth. And we can see the controls in this section change. And if we play it, we have indeed got a pretty classic, slight curve on it, sawtooth. We can change its shape here. Now, this is where it gets a bit interesting because if we go all the way to the left, you see we get what's a pretty classic square wave with that curve on the top and the bottom. And if we go to the center, we get our sawtooth. And if we go to the right, we can see another peak appears and we actually get a sawtooth where we've doubled the pitch. So we've doubled the frequency, gone up an octave. And you can balance between those. So this is pretty flexible, allows you to control that pretty well. We've got two width controls, so we can see that's changing this section here. And you can hear we're getting that kind of PWM sound. And we've got width 2. So we can get some interesting subby kind of sounds in here. And we can see Supervision's having a couple of kittens about tracking this, but we can see we're getting quite an interesting waveform and you've got quite a bit of power. And bear in mind, this is just the raw oscillator sound, nothing else at the moment. We've also got a sub, which in this case is possibly taken away from that, depending on what happens with width 2. But if we go back to, you can hear that's now bringing that in and see the effect it's having. Now, sync is where things get really interesting. So So this is resyncing this oscillator, so it will get restarted, and we can see that happening. So as we go along, we start off with the full waveform, and you can see it's restarting again. So we're getting some really interesting, probably not, in quotes, analog type sounds. And then this is a common feature on quite a few of these modes where we've got a unison detune and a number of voices. So this is a nice feature where if you want to get some width into your sound, you can set the detune. So let's leave it around there and then pick how many voices you have. So if we put that up to 8, you can hear that detuned version, and suddenly we've got a lot of fatness. Got an awful lot going on there. So this is a pretty common thing. If you're ever looking to just give it that fat, chorusy kind of sound, you can do that in any of these oscillators which have this. Next up, let's take a look at modern. So here, picking modern, we're going to pick sawtooth. And as you can see, that means that this sawtooth slider is set to maximum here, and the other waveforms are turned off because 0 is off. We get a fairly modern sawtooth with a fairly straight line on it, unlike the classic one which had quite a curve to it. Now we can turn this off, or we can make it negative. So here we've got our downsloping sawtooth. We've also got a pulse which we can bring in, triangle, and we can mix these in any way we see fit. So we can have maybe some more pulse, some negative sawtooth, etc., and so on. And you can get these interesting waveforms and customize them. So you've got quite a few different things you can do. We can hear the effect and also see all the harmonics that are being generated. So we've got some aggression to that. We can control this width as we've kind of seen previously. So instead of having 2 width controls, we've just got the 1, but this is balanced between the first and second sections. And again, the sync control where things can get nasty really quickly. So we will look at that in a bit more detail in the modulation section. Now, again, unison detune and unison voices. You get the idea with that. So while on the face of it, they may seem to be doing a very similar job, under the covers, they work in different ways, which is one of the reasons why they've been both introduced, and they give different results because the classic oscillator gives us waveforms which have curved tops and bottoms, whereas the modern one gives us much more geometric results. Now let's move on to the next type of oscillator, which is a wavetable. So here with the wavetable selected, we can pick what wavetable we want. So we can click here, and then we've got, as you may expect with Surge, many options. So there are a whole load to go through here, including some which have been provided by various people who've programmed presets and may well be known to you if you spent a bit of time in the YouTube or sound programming community. But let's just start off with something pretty basic. So we'll just start off with sine to sawtooth, and we'll pick the HQ high quality one. So if you're not familiar with a wavetable oscillator, it's effectively a set of samples, and at this end of our table of waves we have a sine wave, and then using the morph control we can move to the other end where we eventually end up with our sawtooth. So we can see we've got 256 different steps, and we can go between them. And if I play this while I'm morphing it, you can see and hear it develop. And if you look on the right hand side of the screen, you can see the harmonics appearing. So with our sawtooth we have loads, and as we go back to being a sine wave, they disappear one by one until we end up with a sine wave. In addition, we've got this vertical skew, which won't make a huge difference, although you can see it's making some difference on a sine wave, but with a more complicated waveform, we get much more of a change. We've also got skew horizontal, which you can see is changing quite a lot about this particular wavetable and introducing more harmonics. We can saturate it with predictable results in terms of the sound and the formant. So this is akin to where we've got the sync in other oscillator types, And this means that we are introducing different harmonics in there. And as we go more format, like we can see the waveform is becoming much more spike-like, and the harmonics that we have are much more at the top end. As ever, we've got unison, detune, and voices. But remember, you've got a huge range of wavetables to go through, and in addition, you wouldn't typically leave this morph control in one place. So in the modulation section, we'll take a look at how you could control this that will change dynamically every time you play a note. Next up, let's take a look at the window oscillator type. Now, the window oscillator type is a wavetable oscillator, but it works in quite a different way. So it's effectively multiplying the wavetable via this window waveform here, and picking a different waveform here will change the sound that you get quite a lot, but we still have the freedom to move through the wavetable as before. So let's take a look at that. So here we can hear we've got this, and if we go all the way through, strangely, you may think we're getting kind of a sine wave. It's not exactly a sine wave, but that is a result of a waveform here. If we pick a different one, we get a different waveform. And now you can see we're going from kind of a sine, but multiplied by that sawtooth. So we get a different effect. It's still a wavetable oscillator, but it's an oscillator which has this extra feature in there. Now, one of the things you may notice here is that the low cut and high cut are not working. You need to enable them by a menu. So to get that, I'm going to two-finger tap, or you'd right-click on a PC and then just activate them, and then we can cut out the lows if we want to. So again, directly in the oscillator, we've got the ability to change what's happening with the waveform. So we don't need to do this kind of filtering in our filter, as we'll see later. We can just do it directly straight away in the oscillator. So that's the two wavetable oscillators that Surge offers us. Next, we're going to move on to the Sine and FM oscillators. So the first of which is Sine. So here's the Sine oscillator. And as we can see, it's producing a sine, as you would expect. But there is a little bit more to it than that. So we can see if we change the shape control here, we get some different waves. So they are sine-like, but they may be rectified sines or sections of a rectified sine, etc. So we get some, in some cases, some pretty vintage sounding. Sound like some vintage organs I used to own. In other cases, much brighter, more attacking sounds. So there's quite a few to experiment with there. And in addition, we have feedback. So I'm going to go back to the sine. So as I add feedback, you can see in here that we add to a much more aggressive sounding waveform. And once we go above about 100%, we get quite a bit of high frequency noise entering in. And the same if we go in a negative feedback direction. Once we go too far, we can get that noise in there, as well as having these pretty unusual waveforms in here. So it's not just a sine. There's a fair bit more than you would expect from what, on the face of it, is just a sine wave oscillator. Next up, FM2. FM synthesis is probably the most challenging concept in most mainstream synthesis sort of operations. It's exactly the kind of thing where just at the point where you think you understand it really well, you tweak a control with complete confidence and then realise you didn't understand what you were doing at all. It's not helped by the slightly unfriendly nature of most FM synths user interfaces. And certainly going back to original hardware synths of the 80s, that was definitely the case. However, the FM synthesis, which is here, is pretty simple, and it's probably a nice one to get started with and give you some idea of what's going on. So let's take a look at FM2 and FM3. So here is FM2, and if we play it with the default controls, we get a sine wave. That's nice and straightforward. So now what we're going to do is add in M1. So M1 is the modulator. So at the moment, it's got no amount, so it's not doing anything, and its ratio is 1:1. So it's the same frequency as our original note. Now, if I bring this in, you will see and hear what happens. So we can see the waveform starts to change, and we hear that harmonic content starting to get generated. And if we go further, it seems to fold back in on itself. Looks like a tooth. And then it gets more and more complicated. So as we add more and more of this in, and it starts to sound like those classic FM synths of the 80s, the simple ones where there wasn't really much going on. Now, that's just with a ratio of 1:1. But if we bring this back to a slightly more sensible range and then change the ratio, you'll see suddenly we get a completely different waveform. And you can hear the harmonics changing as we go up. So I'm just going to keep playing and just move this slider up. I'm not going to go too far. I'll leave you to experiment with that because it can get pretty noise terrorism. But this is the mathematical ratio between the original pitch that you play and the modulator tone. So we're going up the harmonic series here. And that's the way that works. Now, M2 is very much the same thing. So if I turn M1 down, put M2 in, we can see we get the same kind of thing happening. But we can have an offset between the two. So now, if I bring both of them in on the same settings, we can hear that at about 3 hertz. So much more complicated things are happening. And we can also change the phase between them, because sometimes that's crucial. So if we put this back to 0 by double clicking it, now in this case, the phase isn't too much of an issue, but when they are different, we can hear we're getting some different effects in there. Now, finally on here, if we put some feedback in, I'm going to turn M2 down and just have M1 in there. But by having some feedback, you can see the noise is appearing, much like we saw with the sine wave oscillator. And going the other way, say the waveform changes and then we get some noise. So this is looking pretty familiar. Now FM3 is similar, but gives us M3, which is just a fixed frequency. So if you want to get some metallic sounds, this is probably the thing for you, because this doesn't change depending on what note you play. So with M1 and M2, their frequencies are a multiple of the note that you play, whereas with M3, it's just a fixed frequency. So here, if I turn this up, you can hear that sort of bell-like tone. And you can hear we've got this interaction between the two, and as a result, because it's static, we get different effect on every note. It's not following a kind of musical progression. It's much more of a strange. So if we happen to be somewhere around something which works in quotes well with the sound I'm playing, but if I play somewhere else, we get this very discordant tone. Next up, string. So this is a new oscillator for version 1.9, and it emulates the way that a string behaves when it's excited. It's pretty interesting because it gives us an option which not a lot of synths do, which allows us to use incoming audio to trigger that. This means the kind of thing you may have thought, oh, I wonder what would happen if I had an interaction between some external audio and a synth oscillator. It's pretty easy to set up. So we're going to look at its basics, features, and then take a look at it interacting with audio. So here is the string oscillator setup, and if I play that on the default exciter, which is burst noise, sounds like a fairly generic kind of key stroke harpsichord type impersonation sound. Now, we've got decay controls here, so you can hear, if we turn them down, string 1 and string 2 are decaying pretty quickly. We can turn them up. So there, that one is we're hearing much more of string 1. And now we can hear much more of string 2. So they have some variance between them. We can detune string 2. To give it that kind of 12-string sound, etc. And we can even alter the stiffness of the string. We'll make it slack, and then it sounds a bit like a percussion instrument. So that's with the default of burst noise, but we can see from the menu here, we've got a few different options of different noises. But most interestingly, I think, is audio in. So with any of the audio in, we need to route audio to it. So what we're going to do is use the sidechain in Cubase. So if you're doing this in Cubase, you'd need to do the sidechain. If it's another DAW, you'll need to find out how to feed audio into the synth itself. So in the case of Cubase, we turn on sidechaining, and then we pick up our track, which we're going to feed from. So we hit the cog, add a sidechain source. And in this case, I'm going to use a drum loop, which I've got set up because I've already imported this and it's ready to go. I'm going to put it onto pre for reasons that will hopefully become clear. And then I'm going to play it. So in the background, I'll just close that. So in the background, we've got this beat here. I'm going to solo it. I've actually got the volume turned down, so we're not going to hear the drums. I will turn it up momentarily so you can hear what the drums sound like. So we've got that there, but I'm actually going to turn that down. But because our send is on a pre, it doesn't matter. It's still going to get to surge. So if we open up Surge now, I've got some MIDI already playing here. And you can hear that it's using that, and you can hear those drum sounds going by. And if we turn these up, we can play around with these a bit. Maybe we'll make these notes longer. So we get this interesting interaction between the audio that we're feeding in and the oscillator itself. So this is something which we will see in another oscillator in a second, but it's certainly worth experimenting with. You may be hoping for a real-time display here. You're not going to get that in this case, so don't worry if you don't see anything here. But once you've got the hang of routing audio to it, it's quite useful for allowing you to create a more musical version, shall we say, of a loop that you put in. Obviously, if you put in something with pitch and then played appropriate pitches, you could make that work well with it. So the Twist oscillator is based on a hardware module which is available for Eurorack. So if you're into that kind of thing, this presents a lot of oscillator modes, and it really is quite an interesting sense. So you can see we've got all these different engines here. So we've got waveforms which we can go through. So we've got some detuning. So there's an awful lot you can play around with just with this one here. And it gives you some pretty interesting results straight away. And then if we go to Wave Shaper, we've got a completely different set. So this just calling this one oscillator, I don't think really does this any kind of justice at all. So we've got loads you can play with on each one of these. 2-operator FM. We've already seen FM earlier on, but we've got more to play around with. And you can see that working and sounding. But again, it sounds different to FM2 and FM3, so it's worth experimenting with this because while it's a 2-operator FM, it's different to what we've already seen. A whole load to go through. Wavetable, yes, another wavetable. And then you can go through that morphing, etc. So there's an enormous amount to go through with this. Chords. So we're getting those different. Etc. Just it's a joy to play around with. It really is. Some of these you may get less from. So particle noise. You may find you think maybe your keyboard is broken because you don't necessarily get anything out all the time. And same for inharmonic string. Not always getting anything from that, but that will be fun to play with. Analog kick. So let's take that down an octave or two. And there you've got something resembling classic kick, which then you would further change with your envelope generators, etc. But there's a lot to play around with, and this is definitely not something that you'd want to skip some experimentation with. Now, finally, we've got a couple of oscillators which are a little more on the experimental side, shall we say. So the first of which we're going to take a look at is called Alias, and the reason will become apparent as soon as we start listening to it. So with Alias selected, as soon as we play, it may be apparent when looking here that this is not just a sine wave. So we can see we've got some noise happening up here. And the reason is that this is actually, by design, not the world's greatest oscillator. It actually has some aliasing in there. It's 8-bit to start off with. And if we turn down the bits, we get less of a waveform. So we can see the display is showing we're getting fewer bits here. And all of those harmonics start coming in and it starts sounding nasty because that aliasing is coming in, which is precisely why it's called Alias. So we have different waveforms in here. We've got ramp, etc. They all work in a pretty much the same way, but the wrap and mask controls are really where the craziness can begin. So let's go back to the sine. Now, if we start the wrap control, we can see this works quite a lot like re-triggering. But it's changing the actual pitch which is happening. So it's wrapping round as it goes. Now the mask applies a digital mask. So you'll see some binary on one side of this as we go round. And as a result, we get some pretty wacky waveforms pretty quickly. So and if you combine the two, all hell can break loose. And then the threshold just adds some minor changes to that as well. So if I go down an octave on the keyboard, we get some pretty aggressive kind of bass tones, which you could filter later on once we look at the filters. Again, the audio in, I think, is where this really shines. So I'm going to put some audio in. This is noise terrorism, short and simple. So just going to play exactly the same MIDI part and the drum part. So we can see and hear what's happening here. So we're getting something which is definitely related. Let me stop that. So we're getting something which is related to the audio you're putting into it, but you're getting the kind of processing it'd normally take you quite a while to create. You can just put this in here. The relationship between what you're playing in terms of MIDI and what we're hearing coming out is perhaps tenuous at this point. So in fact, what I'm going to do is mute the pre-recorded MIDI and then just play the audio. And we can see with just the audio going, nothing's happening. But if I play a key on the keyboard, but it doesn't matter to any significant degree at this point what note I'm playing different octaves here. If I play up a couple of octaves, we get some changes. And if I go down 2 octaves, it's slightly different, but it's certainly not a playable instrument in that sense. But you can get some nice effects from your original audio being mangled and bit crushed by this, but making it playable either in real time or with recorded MIDI. So there's a lot you can do with this, which will mean you'll be able to make some interesting tones. And these kind of things may not be the main event for you, but they can be pretty useful to put at a low level in a production that you're doing to give it some texture and some low-level noise, which then can be processed to make the production sound more interesting. So often it's not that you want to imitate somebody who specializes in this sort of really extreme kind of distorted, cut-up sound. It's more that you may want this as a textural effect somewhere way back in the mix. That is going to mean that it will work well for you. So sample and hold noise. As we can hear, it definitely belongs in the noise terrorism end of the spectrum. So a bit of playing around with this. It sounds quite a lot like the audio generator on an Atari 2600. So I'm sure if you want to go sort of old school chip tunes kind of thing, there's a lot to be played around with here. And we can see you can certainly hear there's a lot to that. And then if you add in some extra voices, you get a very big sound out of it, which is really interesting with this kind of thing because often they sound pretty thin and weak. But just by adding in extra voices and detuning them, you can get something pretty different. So there you have it, the first part of a look at Surge, which is immense, really. So that's just the oscillators covered. So with the presets that you've got and the ability to change the oscillators, you've probably got a lot you can do already if you just want to experiment with those parts of the synth. But in the next video, we'll take a look at the rest of the synth. So the mixer, the filters, and the modulation section, which is where you've got some real power to create some sounds which change over time as it offers so much flexibility. Unfortunately, because there's so much to cover, this video is already pretty long and I don't want to turn it into an hour and a half of just one synth. So we're going to break it up into a couple of parts. But as ever, I hope you found this useful and you want to experiment with Surge. And if you have, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.